So hi, this is Tony Ward speaking, and welcome to part 3 of this set of online introductions to cognitive psychodynamic therapy. And in this part we're going to start thinking about how we apply the theoretical practical considerations from cognitive psychodynamics to client issues. And we're going to use an example, the example of anxiety, which is one of the chapters that you'll find in the text which my colleague Arnaud Cagnol and I have written, called Cognitive Psychodynamics as an Integrative Framework in Counselling Psychology and Psychotherapy. Before you look at this part and the next part, it'd probably be a very good idea if you download the 2 PDF documents that accompany these videos. So there is a PDF which is an introduction to CPT, and that basically summarizes the principles of cognitive psychodynamic therapy and also gives you a list of points to consider when applying cognitive psychodynamic therapy to client work. And then the second PDF gives you an outline of a particular case that we're going to refer to as the case of Monsieur K. It's one of Arnaud's cases that he has published in the past. And you probably want to read the first episode section of the client vignette at this point. So you might like to stop the video whilst you go off and find that and read that first section. And after reading about Monsieur K, think about how would you conceptualize Monsieur K from whatever theoretical models you are aware of. What sort of an intervention would you have proposed for this client? And have you worked with similar cases where the presenting issue does not seem to be all that there is? Okay, so as I said, you might want to stop at this point and go and read that, but I'm now going to continue. So we've chosen to use anxiety. Incidentally, the slides that I'm working from now are the slides which Arnaud put together for the workshop we did last year, the Division of Counselling Psychology annual conference in Cardiff in 2019, and that's why the format's changed slightly, and we now have a blue background, which I'm going to stick with these slides which Arnaud did. So anxiety is a very prevalent concern for our clients. It consists of a sense of threat that people will acknowledge isn't particularly well founded. The kinds of anxieties people experience can be many and varied. They can be generalized, for example. They can be very focused. They can be triggered by an external event in the example of phobias, or indeed they can be triggered internally by some kind of a thought or an internal state, if you like. You may know that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual now tends to separate these things out. We don't see them as being all that different, and so we're going to keep them together for the purpose of this discussion and think about how we can work with these from a cognitive psychodynamic perspective. So the cognitive psychodynamic view would suggest that the symptoms of anxiety that clients bring to us can be understood better from looking at the individual's life, their life history, their life story. In other words, from thinking about their inner world. It can be helpful in overcoming resistance to treatment where people seem to be struggling with anxiety. Often you will be aware that cognitive behavioural methods can be extremely effective with anxiety and often will be a first line approach, but it's not always that successful. In some cases the anxiety can recur, and sometimes difficulties are created by the coexistence of other issues such as depression, substance use, personal adjustment, and so on. And we would suggest, therefore, that the cognitive psychodynamic approach will allow us to take into account the specifics of the individual, their experience, their inner world, and therefore tailor the treatment to our particular client. Think about phobia for a second. Phobia, the issue is often well defined. There's often a fairly clear trigger. It can be a fear of being in a presence of a specific type of object or situation, generally acknowledged to be irrational, often leading to the triggering of a panic attack, which can be more or less severe and will then often lead to clients going into a pattern of avoidance. And we talked earlier in the Grauver's theory of how people meet their basic psychological needs of the two tendencies of approach avoidance. So where a situation has become perceived to be very difficult, clients will choose to try and avoid it. And you will be aware that there are specific types of phobia: agoraphobia, fear of open public spaces, social phobias, and lots of specific phobias. Arachnophobia, for example, fear of spiders, fear of aeroplanes, etc. So, in looking at a particular case of anxiety, there may well be a traumatic factor which can be clear. If people have a fear of dogs, for example, they may be able to describe an event that occurred to them when maybe they were attacked as a child. There may well be biological, genetic, or family and environment issues which suggests that person might have a vulnerability. There may be early adverse experiences, things that happened in the person's earlier life, which may have had limited opportunities for control. Remember that control is a very important basic psychological need that people strive to attain. People may have learned a range of inappropriate responses, what we would term maladaptive schemas. The behavioural approach would be to typically use exposure, often graded exposure. Nowadays may well use virtual reality. And that, of course, can be sufficient to cure many phobias. Some clients can be very reluctant to engage in this and they may drop out. Clients may experience multiple different and resistant phobias, or there may be some kind of background of personality adjustment problems. It may be that our clients improve initially, but then don't seem to improve. They reach a plateau, or may even go backwards and regress. So how do we tackle the depth and the extension of the roots of a phobia in the inner world? And this is where we move in to the cognitive psychodynamic approach. So I suggested earlier that you have a read about Monsieur K before progressing, so hopefully you've had a chance to do that. If not, you might want to make sure that you do that now before moving on. So how do we overcome a therapeutic blockage? So cognitive therapies address the schemas which exist. They might look at metacognitive beliefs that people have forged from their past experience, the things people believe about the situation. We may try to guide how people interpret situations. We may look at the ways in which thoughts are activated automatically and what emotions become present. So, for example, people may have a recognition schema. Recognition in the sense of needing to feel valued. So my life depends on other people liking me. And if I'm worried that other people may not like me, then I may avoid other people. or having a control schema. I must always be on control. If I'm not in control, X, Y, Z might happen. We might try to help clients, therefore, to relax these rigid schemas that they built up that underlie the phobic behaviour. Severe cases can often weigh on the entire inner world, the whole of the person's subjective internal experience, and often, in such cases, be anchored in the personal history and past of the client. So how do we address these in a cognitive psychodynamic way? Thinking about the phenomenology of a panic attack, for example, a situation that clients experience as extremely distressing and difficult when faced with the phobic situation. The sense of panic is out of all disproportion with the real situation, as if the entire inner being, inner world of the client feels as if it's coming apart, which we've illustrated here with these. The metaphor being used here is of a solid ice forming the surface of the person's inner world, which feels as if the whole of it is cracking and falling apart. So it feels like a catastrophic threat. The whole of the person's inner being, core self, is being threatened by the situation. So this small shock, this small event, seems to be revealing hidden dramatic tensions, that there is some sort of fault lying through the inner world that is always there. There is some inner vulnerability that it may be quiet until triggered, and then suddenly causes this huge shock. It could be apparent what that traumatic factor was. For example, we know in traumas that such things as car accidents, people are very aware of the event and have significant memories of it. Or thinking about schematic memory and the way that distant memories may not be that open to recollection, but they're still there in memory, perhaps sending reverberations down through many years, which the client is vaguely or dimly aware of at all. And here we're talking about the implicit aspects of memory. So that the phobic experience, the phobic situation, resonates through the whole of the person's core inner world, causing the symbolic web to link to these past situations. There is in essence, therefore, somewhere in that person's construction of their inner world, a phobic core, something very deep-rooted, potential source of their anxiety, which can send waves through their inner world in later years in response to some triggering event. So if there is no recent traumatic factor that the person might be aware of, and this may suggest the notion of the whole of the inner world collapsing, that there's a resonance of the original phobic situation throughout all of the connections, perhaps stemming through to what Arno's called here the founding space, the original. So this is going right back to when our inner world is being constructed in our earliest experiences, in early childhood, situations and events which we may have little conscious recall of as adults. It may affect the meaning of the whole of the inner world. And Arno has referred to one metaphor we can use for that is the home ideal, that if you remember back to Grauver's theory of basic psychological needs, that need for control, that need for orientation, that need for safety, that need for pleasure, that need for attachment as well, and the opportunity within that early environment of enhancing our feelings of ourselves. So to the extent that these things are present in our early experience, when our inner core is being founded and built, we will have strong foundations. But to the extent that that's not the case, then that very early inner world may be constructed on less solid foundations. Which means because we have this flaw running through the inner world based on these early difficult foundations, there is a flaw in the home ideal. Perhaps this issue therefore runs back to early childhood. Issues in the childhood home may involve issues around the parents, parental figures, may be part of the basis of the person's self-esteem. So we have this notion of this phobic inner core, an ancient conflict within the founding space, leading to that traumatic intuition of a possible calamity. The foundational space doesn't feel secure, and therefore any future traumatic event or anxiety-provoking incident could threaten the whole structure and make us feel as if the whole house could come falling down at any instant. So what we would like to suggest you do now is to read on further in the case vignette of Monsieur K and read about the second episode. And I presented here the diagrams that we use to think about, to conceptualize clients within cognitive psychodynamic therapy. So in terms of Monsieur K, can you think about what are the conscious cognitions that Monsieur K might be experiencing? What does his past inner experience encoded in his inner world look like? What sort of autobiographical memories might he have? What kinds of schemas and scripts might he have built up? And how is all this affecting his behaviour, the patterns by which he chooses to go about living his life? And in thinking about that and seeing if you can use this figure to conceptualize Monsieur K from the CPT framework, that brings us to the end of part 3.